My friends, since we're in this theme of the battle of attrition, can you guess the average life expectancy of an American rifleman during World War II before he became a casualty? Most estimates place it at 7 to 10 days. If you were lucky! For the US Army, the 1944-1945 campaign in Western Europe was literally a meat grinder, marked by catastrophic losses that were simply unsustainable in the long run. After my research, contrary to popular belief, the American command treated its troops as if they were mere disposable spare parts. All this thanks to the IRS. No, not that one, but the equally unpleasant to deal with, the Individual Replacement System, also known as
Operation Human Shield.
Our perception of World War II from the American perspective was skewed by Hollywood war movies, like To Hell and Back, Patton, Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, Fury.
America, fuck yeah!
But did you hear about a movie called The Battle of San Pietro? Probably not. In 1943, director John Huston and his team were attached to the US Army's 143rd Regiment. For the most authentic depiction, Huston's cameraman filmed alongside the infantrymen as they fought their way up the hills to reach an Italian village called San Pietro. This movie or documentary was only released to the public after the war, because it was considered to be too realistic and that it would hurt the morale of the troops. That's because casualties were atrociously high to capture this random Italian village. The company commander of the 143rd Infantry Regiment said, "I had 184 men. 48 hours later, I had 17. If that's not mass murder, I don't know what is." Can you imagine that? A 91% casualty rate. And the worst is that all these positions had to be filled with replacements with barely any training. And then they went on another assault. And guess what? The company disappeared yet again. Actually, that's very similar to the story of the 1998 war movie called When Trumpets Fade about the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest. More on that later in the video. That was the reality for US infantrymen during World War II that nobody wants to talk about. The author of the book, Band of Brothers, Stephen Ambrose, wrote another one called Citizen Soldiers, where he evaluated the individual replacement system and called it inefficient, wasteful, and possibly a cause of unnecessary loss of life. Right after World War II, analysts even called it criminal. Boys with zero infantry training sent right into the line of fire, and whose life expectancy at the front was a couple days at best. For some, only a few hours.
Cannon fodder. That's what we are.
My friends, because of all that, being an American infantryman during World War II was hell. This video is sponsored by MyHeritage. I partnered with MyHeritage to build my family tree and know more about my ancestors. What struck me was how smooth the entire process was. It's very straightforward. All I did was input as many names that I could, and MyHeritage will piece together your family tree for you by looking through 19 billion historical records. On their website, I even managed to colorize, restore, and enhance some of my old family pictures. Colorizing old pictures is definitely one of my favorite features. You can even use their state-of-the-art deep nostalgia technology to animate all these pictures. Thanks to MyHeritage, I managed to trace back my entire lineage until the early 1800s, filling up this entire family tree. You remember what I told you last time? My ancestors decided to simply pass down the exact same names to their sons over and over for generations. Must have been very confusing at family gatherings. It's been several months now, and I managed to make many new discoveries. With MyHeritage, I found so many names and places of birth and death, as well as obituaries. That's how I found the graves of my great-grandfather and his wife, my great-grandmother. My dad was very happy because he didn't know where all these relatives were buried, so we went there and paid our respects. I also learned interesting stories about my ancestors that fought during World War I. As a kid, my father remembered his grandfather talking about his 3 older brothers that died during the Great War. Thanks to MyHeritage, I found the records and I cleared up this entire story. My great-grandfather was too young to fight, but he actually had 5 older brothers, 4 of which went to war. Out of the 4 brothers, one was K, another was wounded, one was captured by the enemy, and the last one came through unscathed. I learned all this thanks to my heritage. If you're interested in studying your family history, I think you'll love it the same way I did. Using my link in the description below, sign up for a 14-day free trial and enjoy all the amazing features my heritage has to offer. In 1940, with the prospects of a global war looming, the United States were getting their troops ready. Originally, the Chief of Staff of the US Army, George Marshall, planned for a 265 Division Army, with a unit rotation system similar to the British and other allies. How this worked was pretty simple. Divisions would go into battle. When the troops got eroded, the entire division would be replaced by another one and sent back to the rear to refit. However, by mid-1943, due to pressure to preserve manpower for industry and agriculture, Marshall shifted to a 90-division army, which led to the innovative individual replacement system. US military planners deemed it logistically difficult to transport across the globe the equipment and manpower necessary to arm entire replacement units. So rather than rotating entire divisions, the US Army would only replace soldiers on an individual basis. That was essentially the American policy during World War I, but during the Great War the system was sort of chaotic and unorganized. So the main difference is that World War II planners were more proactive in anticipating and managing casualties, added to a more structured approach. We can even talk of an industrial approach to warfare. As an analogy, in a factory, if you have one of your machines that breaks down, you don't halt production and change the entire machine. That would be logistically too complicated. You simply repair the broken parts with new ones. And before you know it, production is up and running again. All you need to do is make sure to have enough spare parts. It was a revolutionary and brilliant system, at least on paper, because US planners would soon discover that you cannot think of human resources the same way you would with machines. Although American soldiers got their first taste of battle during the amphibious landings in North Africa, the real test took place in Tunisia. There, the inexperienced American troops suffered a notable defeat at the Kasserine Pass against the veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps. Eventually, the reorganized US 2nd Corps got back on its feet and, together with the British 8th Army, pushed the German and Italian forces out of North Africa. What's interesting is that the Tunisian campaign brought the early complaints about the individual replacement system. Colonel George A. Taylor of the 1st Infantry Division said, "The problem with these replacements is that they aren't given time to learn. We lose them almost as fast as we get them. They don't last long." However, during the battles in Tunisia and 2 months later in Sicily, the effects of this replacement system were not immediately felt due to the slower pace of operations, which allowed for better integration of new elements. US casualties were also relatively low up to that point. 18,500 in Tunisia and below 9,000 in Sicily. However, this would change when they reached the Italian mainland. The first problem occurred after the Allied landing in Salerno in September 1943. Despite limited resources, German Generalfeldmarschall Kesselring expertly leveraged Italy's rugged terrain, establishing strong defensive positions along natural barriers like mountains and rivers. He constructed multiple defensive lines back to back, such as the heavily fortified Gustav Line at Monte Cassino, designed to slow down and inflict heavy casualties on the advancing Allied forces. During these attacks, where mechanized formations were of little use, due to the terrain plus all the bunkers and strongholds that had to be cleared one by one. It was American riflemen that had to do the heavy lifting. During the first 6 months of the Italian campaign, only 34% of the infantrymen in line companies came overseas with their units, meaning 66% came in as replacements, a fact which illustrates the high number of American casualties at this point of the war. On top of that, US planners noticed the increasing number of casualties related to battle fatigue. The prolonged fighting without rest led to numerous psychological breakdowns that accounted for 20 to 25% of all non-battle evacuations. That's because at the time there was no tour of duty for American troops. If you were positioned on the contact line, you could not get out until the end of the war, or until you became a casualty. Let's just say for those guys that landed in North Africa, the odds were stacked against them. Sergeant Williamson of the 36th Infantry Division reported, "You couldn't escape it. The shells, the constant mortar fire. The new guys cracked quick. But even the old guys, the tough ones, started going blank, talking to themselves, shaking or just freezing up. For example, this 36th Infantry Division of the Texas National Guard suffered 8,000 to 9,000 casualties between September 1943 and March 1944. That's over 50% of the strength of a US infantry division. As we saw in the introduction, the division got wrecked against San Pietro in December 1943, and then again a month later in January when it was tasked with crossing the Garry River in an attempt to bypass Monte Cassino. It was a debacle. One of the worst setbacks in American military history. The 141st and 143rd Infantry Regiment were virtually destroyed. According to after-battle reports, they lost over 2,000 casualties within 48 hours. Congress even conducted an investigation about the events surrounding the battle. And the worst is that most of these men at that point were replacements. This was their first battle and the last one. By that time, the 36th Infantry Division only had one infantry regiment left, and eventually withdrew from the line on the 12th of March 1944 for rest and to refit, before being deployed into yet another meat grinder, Anzio. In the spring of 1944, after analyzing the combat reports in Italy, American General Dever suggested that relieving divisions every 30 to 40 days would reduce casualties. For instance, in the Pacific, Marines who were primarily volunteers would hop from island to island, and after an intense period of heavy fighting, they were rotated out for rest and recovery. At the same time, they could assimilate new replacements into the existing structure. Although General Devers was right, the problem is that to the eyes of the factory managers, the individual replacement system had not completely failed. From the landings in Salerno in September 1943 through the grueling battles leading up to the breaking of the Gustav Line and the liberation of Rome in June 1944, the US Fifth Army under General Clark reported over 80,000 casualties, 4 times more than in Tunisia. But once again, nearly all had been replaced. 41,000 men returned from hospitals and 35,000 new replacements were supplied. The IRS allowed US infantry regiments to constantly fight at full strength, and allowed combat units to maintain their operational ability at all times. For example, it was preferable to have 12 men in a squad, even if most of them were newbies, than to ask an understrength squad of 4 veterans to storm an enemy position. With that being said, the fighting in France would bring an entire new dimension to this problem. The divisions preparing to land in Normandy were by far the best trained and equipped of the US Army during World War II. The units that already witnessed combat, like the 1st Infantry Division, got replenished, when many of the wounded soldiers of the Battle of Sicily joined back their regiments. The others, although inexperienced, had been training since 1942. Prior to the Normandy landings, the War Department estimated that 40% of all casualties would occur among riflemen. To address this, at least 40% of all replacements had to undergo infantry training. That would ensure that there were always enough spare parts to keep this US war machine running. While casualties on D-Day were lighter than expected, the same cannot be said about the remainder of the Normandy campaign. The intense fighting and the tactical advantage provided by the hedgerows covering the region led to a rapid depletion of American infantry units. Technician 4th grade David Rothbart was one of the soldiers responsible for assigning replacements to their units. He is known for his detailed memoir, a soldier's journal with the 22nd Infantry Regiment during World War II, which provides a vivid account of his experiences. Drafted in 1942, he served in Company E, 2nd Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment Personnel Section, 4th Infantry Division. On June 30th, 1944, so 3 weeks into the Normandy campaign, he recorded that the turnover of personnel in the rifle companies since D-Day was over 100%. Statistically, by the end of June, almost everybody that landed on June 6 on Utah Beach had either been KIA or wounded. On July 2, 1944, Rothbart reported the alarming casualty rate units were suffering. One company, for instance, only had 30 survivors out of 200 men with which it had started the campaign. The Battle of Normandy was truly brutal. With that being said, wounded US soldiers could at least benefit from excellent medical services. In turn, it largely decreased battlefield fatalities as the mortality rate of wounded troops was just 3%. Now it's important to note that although the majority of the replacements were simple riflemen, a good number were also NCOs and officers. Rothbard said, I quote, "Later I saw many green lieutenants sent up to take over platoons in the thick of battle. More often than not, junior officers did not even know the names of the soldiers they would have to lead to combat. To simplify commands, every soldier was given a number, just like a spare part, which unit leaders would call to move forward."
Number 1. Number 5.
On July 11th, Rothbard reported, "It is common for a rifle company to start fighting with a strength of 170 men, and the next day go into battle with 70, while on that same day turning over 3 or 4 company commanders. Imagine working your 8-hour shift in a restaurant, and every 2 hours you have a new manager in charge."
Fuck.
Lieutenant George Wilson wrote a book called If You Survive, about his experiences during World War II. He received his baptism of fire near Saint-Lô during Operation Cobra, the breakout of Normandy, and soon realized that infantry training and his officer course failed to prepare him for the reality of the battlefield. Wilson wrote, "While training was based on leading a full-strength unit, in actual combat I found myself at about half strength or less much of the time. This makes a big difference in tactics." By his 4th day of combat, only 6 of the original 40 men of Wilson's platoon remained. Meanwhile, another unit, Company E, only had 27 men left of its initial 168 soldiers. As for Wilson, of all the men and officers that started with him in Company F, he was the only one who made it to the end of the war. 1 in 200. Meaning if you started in Normandy in late July 1944, you had a 0.5% chance of getting through the war unscathed.
The worst trade deal ever made.
Of course, the only reason US infantry regiments could still push forward was because for every loss you had the infamous replacements. So let's take a minute to talk about these replacements. Everything started in the United States, where soldiers received both basic and specialized training before being sent overseas as individuals, meaning they would not end up fighting with the man they created a bond with during all these weeks and months of training. Upon arrival in France, they were held in replacement depots, called repos depots by the GIs. Replacements were often moved from one depot to another. Sometimes they sat there for weeks, where they essentially forgot everything they had learned. Up until one morning they were assigned to a unit for duty. The common image was one of a replacement arriving in the evening, joining an infantry squad, and being KIA the next day before anyone even knew who he was. It's very tragic and nobody talks about this. I cannot understand why Call of Duty is not gonna make a game about this. Alright, which mission should I play? That's where you'll tell me. Hold on, if this problem was so bad, how come the Allies won the Battle of Normandy? Yes, very good point. Let's use the example of an actual battle. During the month-long battle for Hill 192, on the outskirts of Saint-Lô, the US 2nd Infantry Division suffered 594 KIA and approximately 3,000 wounded. Roughly 3,600 casualties that were replaced almost instantly. In front of them, the German 3rd Paratrooper Division that was defending the sector was suffering from severe attrition, since for them replacements only arrived sporadically, and too few in number to replenish combat units. And the German command essentially had no available reserves to rotate out this division. On top of that, German units were crushed by American firepower. On the 1st of July, US artillery batteries fired 13,000 rounds across the front, with a peak of 25,000 shells on the 11th of July during the final push beyond Hill 192 against the town of Saint-Lô. Overall, the Normandy campaign was a pure battle of attrition. The US Army lost 135,000 casualties, and during that time it received 25,000 replacements in June, 50,000 in July, and 60,000 in August, for a total of, magic, 135,000 replacements. The Wehrmacht had given it all in the bocage. They fought like devils, just to face an enemy the same size as before. On a side note, the same could not be said of the British Army. In Normandy, their rifle companies suffered greatly, and after years of war, they faced a severe lack of replacements. In his post-war memoirs, British General Montgomery wrote, "The struggle to replenish our ranks made us more cautious than we might have wished." And this careful approach drew a lot of criticism from their American counterparts, who understood this as a lack of commitment and courage. To this day, every US war movie has to throw jabs at the Brits, but that deserves a video of its own. After the victory of the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, Allied forces rushed eastwards towards the German border. We all know that the US Army's slowdown in fall 1944 was caused by logistics issues, lack of fuel, lack of trucks, certainly. But another factor could simply be because the fighting capability of US infantry regiments were dwindling due to the high rotation of personnel and the lack of cohesion. Although in this analysis we're focusing on American riflemen, the same could be said of US tank crews. It can be argued that many Shermans were lost not because of poor design, but rather due to amateur tactical skills. Such a topic would require once again a video of its own, but you can imagine the consequences of a high rotation of green replacements in an environment that requires high coordination and cohesion. If one crew member makes mistakes, it puts the entire 5-man team at risk of getting blown up. By September 1944, Allied forces were approaching the German border. Feeling that victory was near and that the Germans were approaching a breaking point, General Bradley ordered all US armies to press forward on a broad front, just like Grant ordered Union forces to do the same in the spring of 1864. But let's just say Bradley would go through the same overland campaign nightmare. Patton's Third Army raced 640 kilometers from the hedgerows of Normandy to the east of France and Lorraine in less than a month. However, the next 100 kilometers took him over 3 months and resulted in unbearable casualties. The much forgotten Lorraine campaign accounted for over 55,000 combat casualties, approximately 1/3 of the total losses sustained by Patton's Third Army throughout the entire European campaign. It's not a surprise that this battle was sort of shoved under the rug as it went against the main narrative. Let's just say Patton was not simply slowed by faltering logistics. While Patton's tanks maneuvered well around Nancy in September 1944, most notably at the Battle of Haraucourt, his riflemen were not as lucky due to his aggressive, broad front approach, which led to pillbox attacks. For example, the 80th Infantry Division suffered over 3,000 losses in September while crossing the Moselle River. And as for the 35th Division, 1,000 casualties in a couple days only during intense fighting for the Gremessé forest. In late September, the American command of the Third Army believed the Germans to be exhausted, and that storming the stronghold of Metz would be easy. This would prove to be a very costly mistake. The city was surrounded by numerous forts built by the Germans between 1870 and 1918. All these positions were connected by entrenchments and tunnels, and at last, American replacements would not face demoralized German troops, but heavily fortified, battle-hardened veterans from the Eastern Front. Despite heavy artillery shelling and non-stop aerial bombardments, every step forward was marked by heavy losses. For example, on the 3rd of October, the 5th US Division mounted an ill-planned attack on Fort Drian, a stronghold located 10 kilometers southwest of Metz. Let's just say that 10 days later the battle turned into a real mess. The American 10th and 11th Infantry Regiments were down 50% and were forced to abandon the fort due to yet another German counterattack. It didn't help that US Division commanders kept attacking German fortifications head-on. With that being said, I'm not surprised. It was the only logical outcome. You can't pull off crazy maneuvers when the bulk of your troops are inexperienced. You just stick to the basics and hope for the best. And we even have an interesting quote about this exact battle. The commanding officer of Company G, 11th Infantry Regiment, said he received a batch of replacements that were supposed to be anti-aircraft personnel that didn't know how to use rifles. And even worse, their NCOs received zero infantry training. He said, I quote, "I made a few squad leaders out of the old men that I had left. They were not too good, but they were the best I could get. They had battle experience, but lacked the necessary leadership. He reported the following about the second attack on Fort Riant. We had trouble with replacements. We could not get them to advance. The old men were tired and the new men were afraid. During the 3 days we were in the breach of the fortifications, we spent our time keeping the men in line. That's how most of the leaders were lost, exposing themselves to get this done. As you can see, there is a clear correlation between high NCO and officer losses when leading unmotivated and poorly trained troops. And the problem is that replacing these officers will be extremely difficult. The CEO of Company G stated that storming the fort would have been impossible without the overwhelming firepower that the GIs had at their disposal. By the end of October, the German command had achieved its objective. It had not only slowed down American forces, but they were also able to rotate out their elite combat formations, which they replaced with Tier 2 Volksgrenadiers composed of teenagers and old men. This is when American troops should have easily been able to break through, but then heavy rain made progress extremely difficult. One senior officer remembered, "Many of our rifle platoons are fighting with the strength of 17 men led by an NCO. The lack of rotation also had an unexpected side effect: non-battle casualties. The US 26th Division alone reported 3,000 cases of trench foot during the November offensive. The worst is that 95% of trench foot cases would be out of action until the spring of 1945. Put simply, a lot of riflemen were lost due to negligence from the high command. Many more would suffer from frostbite, respiratory infections, and dysentery just because they spent day after day in foxholes filled with freezing water, without rest or being able to change clothes. This also led to an increasing amount of psychological casualties. As an example, this can be found in one of the deleted scenes of the war movie Fury.
I can't take any more. All the original boys are gone, they're dead or mangled. Some of them boys been replaced 5 times.
All this to say that by the end of November, 89% of the losses of the 3rd Army were regrouped among infantry units. And due to the broad front offensive, Patton could no longer obtain enough riflemen as replacements. To keep the momentum going, Patton drafted 5% of support troops for immediate retraining as infantrymen to get an extra 7,500 troops. In the end, the US Army won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The Lorraine campaign ended on the 13th of December when the German garrison of the last fort around Metz surrendered. To be fair, Patton did make it to the German border, although he would only reach the Rhine by March 1945. And his push would depart from Luxembourg, not even from his gains in Lorraine. Just like the Battle of Metz was an ice-cold shower for Patton's 3rd Army, the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest would prove to be an equally unpleasant surprise for Hodge's 1st Army. Hodges faced the difficult task of storming the Siegfried Line. The terrain of the Hürtgen Forest was characterized by dense foliage. Rugged hills and limited visibility also reduced the effects of American firepower. Additionally, the muddy conditions and narrow paths limited the effectiveness of mechanized units. I went to the Hürtgen Forest in September 2022, and let me tell you, it was cold up there. There's so many trees that you don't even see 10 meters in front of you. I couldn't see anything as I was looking for bunkers, but I guess it's the bunkers that found me. Just like it did for American soldiers exactly 80 years ago. In September 1944, the US 9th Infantry Division made its first moves into the Hürtgen Forest. By mid-October, the division had only gained 3 kilometers at a cost of 4,500 KIA and wounded. In November, a renewed offensive was launched by the 28th Infantry Division, now commanded by Major General Norman Cota. However, after 12 days of action, the 28th Division was effectively considered as destroyed as a fighting unit, with all its battalions having been shifted from attack to a positional defense. Very little ground was gained and casualties totaled 6,184 men. The 5th Battalion of the 112th Regiment even witnessed an all-out rout, which was almost unheard of about American troops up until that moment. Just like many commanders had complained about in the past, Cota blamed the catastrophic attrition rate on the overabundance of new men in the ranks, who were unfamiliar with both their NCOs and their comrades. In those 12 days, 3,903 replacements were sent to the division, only covering 54% of officer and 84% of enlisted losses. The factory managers could simply not keep up with the rate of spare parts that were getting used up. And to make things even worse, replacements who made it through a week's combat sometimes found themselves the veterans in their companies. And that's exactly the story of the movie When Trumpets Fade. After his first week in combat, Private David Manning is the only man standing in his squad. Because of his veteran status, he's made sergeant and given command of a squad of new replacements. A few days later, due to heavy losses, Manning is the only NCO left, and because of that, he's promoted to platoon leader. Here's what American veterans told the Washington Post in 2004. Junior Officer Paul Fussell related a story about the attack on the village of Schmidt. We did not take it. We were cut to pieces, slashed to ribbons. Sergeant Frisbee also remembered dealing with replacements. Before you ever knew who they were or could assign them to a platoon, they were hit. Can you imagine such a turnover? It's worse than working at McDonald's. He said barely anyone of the original 20th Division that landed in France in August 1944 was still there by November, meaning that combat experience was constantly lost. German troops could easily pull off the same good old tricks because all they had in front of them were newbie replacements. Even the mighty Big Red 1 Division suffered greatly in the fall of 1944. 5,000 casualties in Aachen, and then another 3,000 casualties in the Hürtgen forest, to the extent where the 1st Infantry Division essentially lost its elite status. Frank Kolb said, "We had a good unit with plenty of seasoned people. By D-Day, for instance, all our wounded from Sicily had rejoined the unit. Everyone was well trained and we were a fighting machine. However, by the time of the Hürtgen forest, Kolb lamented that the fighting capacity of the division just crashed, as replacements started pouring in infantry regiments. Same thing for our friend Lieutenant George Wilson of the 4th Division, who was all but appalled by the manpower losses in the Hürtgen forest. He recalled starting the day with 150 riflemen, medics, non-coms and officers. By nightfall, they had lost nearly everyone, 138 out of 150 men.
No fucking way, no fucking way, no fucking way!
Replacements then brought the numbers up to 78 the next day, but Wilson was reluctant to lead a company that was now 85% inexperienced troops. During the campaign, Wilson's unit faced 167% casualties. From the original 162 men in his company, 287 became casualties if we factor in the replacements. The 4th Division 22nd Infantry Regiment entered the Hürtgen Forest on November 16, 1944. Within 2 weeks, nearly 100% of its 3,000 men were replaced. Sergeant David Rothbart noted the chaos. Leaders didn't know their men and soldiers barely knew their commanders. 2 years after the war, Major Frederick Kent studied the battle from the perspective of the 22nd Infantry Regiment for the Advanced Infantry Officers Course at Fort Benning. Now called Fort Moore. His conclusion was the following. The failure to relieve the regiment and the remainder of the division after a few days of fighting as severe as this action was, in my opinion, the direct cause of hundreds of casualties, which might have been avoided by the timely relief of the division. Now everyone, listen closely. He ended by saying, I quote, "In my opinion, almost a criminal waste of valuable manpower, and should have never been allowed to occur." The other drama is that on average 28% of the replacements were wounded soldiers that recovered from their injuries and returned to the front. Thing is, more often than it should have. These returning riflemen were sent to different units than they originally belonged to. Although they had combat experience, all of a sudden they found themselves in companies where they didn't know anyone. As you can imagine, the intense fighting in fall and the continuous combat since September took its toll on US troops. In other words, the US Army needed a serious break in order to replenish its ranks. The experiences of the Lorraine campaign and the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest were clearly not enough. Nobody listened to General Devers. Major General Koda was also ignored when he suggested the assignment of new troops in squads, instead of the individual replacement system, due to the lengthening of the front for US armies. Not only did the American command send untrained newbies right on the contact line, They thought it would be a brilliant idea to do the same, but this time on a larger scale, with the freshly created 106th Infantry Division. Since the US command did not implement division rotations, the 106th Division was simply assigned a sector of the front despite having zero combat experience. And that's how they entered the area of operations on the 10th of December 1944. Can you guess where? That's right, in the Ardennes. 6 days later, the division was gone.
A shameful display!
What a complete waste of manpower. The Battle of the Bulge would prove to be extremely difficult, as the US Army experienced 81,000 losses. It was the Battle of Hürtgen Forest on roids. By late December 1944, the manpower shortage was so critical that in a desperate move, Eisenhower ordered immediate reinforcements, sending anyone that could walk, including cooks, clerks, and truck drivers, to the front. One notable example is Corporal Charles D. Birch. He recalled, "I was driving a truck one day and the next I was in the front line. No one had prepared us for this. We were just told to go out and fight." Similarly, supply clerk George McGee shared his thoughts about this sudden shift. One moment you're sorting out rations and the next you're dodging bullets. At last, Private First Class Thomas E. Johnson, who was only a cook, was just drafted into an infantry company. He said, "They put us in a trench and told us to hold our position. I had never even fired a rifle before." As you can see, these replacements were untrained and ill-prepared, causing significant strain on the front line. John Klein from the 106th Infantry Division recounts, "We were overwhelmed with inexperienced replacements. They came up with no combat training, no winter gear, yet they had to fill in the gaps left by so many casualties." And guess what? The lack of proper equipment led to the rise of non-battle casualties. You know the drill: frostbite, trench foot, and so on. As fast as they came in, they got out, thus leading the American command to require more replacements. However, despite the poor weather which pinned down the Air Force, American troops did benefit from intense artillery support, which fired relentlessly on enemy positions, like the 53,000 rounds fired by the 6th Armored Division's artillery group from the 1st to the 7th of January 1945. This is where we have to admit that the US Army's logistics allowed for this never-ending shelling of German positions. Across the entire Western Theater, the US Army suffered 77,700 battle casualties in December 1944, 69,100 in January 1945, and 39,400 in February, for a total of 186,200 KIA wounded or missing. Meanwhile, 70,000 replacements arrived in December, 80,000 in January, of which many called from other theaters, and 70,000 more arrived in February, for a total of 220,000 replacements, for a net positive of 34,000 troops for the US Army. Meanwhile, the Germans could simply not stomach this battle of attrition, especially with the advancing Soviet armies on their eastern flank, a black hole that swallowed entire German divisions on a daily basis. By February 1945, we can say that it was a brand new US Army that was about to write the final chapter of the war. A new US Army filled with tens of thousands of replacements. This was possible because in early 1945, 55,000 Army Air Force and 25,000 Army Services Forces personnel were integrated into the ground forces. On top of that, the arrival of new formations that trained together brought new energy to the US Army, like the 71st, 78th, 97th, 102nd, 104th Infantry Divisions that would all participate in the invasion of Germany. Even the 106th Infantry Division that was virtually destroyed in December was replenished. Lieutenant Colonel William D. Smith, the commander of the 2nd Battalion, 422nd Infantry Regiment, acknowledged, "The rapid influx of replacements was both a blessing and a curse. On one end, these guys were untrained and inexperienced, but at least the Americans had the manpower to fill in the ranks, which was essential to carry on offensive operations." On February 12th, Sergeant Rothbart lamented that only a handful of Normandy veterans remained in his unit. He wrote the following, "In the last few days, I have seen more of them KIA Men whose days in combat far exceeded any reasonable chance of surviving. Once again, imagine the effect it had on the morale of the troops. Even the seasoned combat veterans had no chance of surviving. Imagine your chances of survival as a replacement that arrived last night. Rothbart mentioned one of his comrades, Corporal Raymond C. Schmaltze. He landed on D-Day and was KIA in early February, after about 250 consecutive days in action. To the new replacements, it just showed that there was no way out. They were literally in hell.
Horror.
If the United States wanted to finish off Germany as quickly as possible, they needed to muster all the forces available, including turning a blind eye on segregation. On February 9th, Eisenhower wrote to Marshall, because of lack of time and facilities to train specialists, it appears that I have to use African American volunteers by platoons. Patton has done this and it apparently works. Ah, good old Patton, right? He was always one step ahead. I mean, this situation is very funny. It's just like during the US Civil War, right? When Union forces suddenly lacked manpower, they're like, oh, here African Americans, you have the right to become soldiers. I mean, because of segregation policies, African American replacements could not be sent individually to white combat units. So instead they were assigned as platoons into existing companies. That's where the US command noticed that these platoons of African Americans performed very well on the battlefield, much better than the individual replacements. When casualties inside these African American rifle platoons had so reduced the units as to destroy their identity, the platoons were simply inactivated, and a new one would take its place. AKA the Americans implemented a variation of the German army's rotation policy, just on a smaller scale. But the war was not over yet. By February 1945, US troops launched an offensive across the entire front to reach the Rhine. Despite the Wehrmacht being crippled AF, American soldiers struggled, especially due to the countless river crossing operations that had to be carried out. Most people are unaware that the invasion of Germany was no walk in the park. It was actually one of the most costly campaigns for the Americans during World War II. From February 1945 to the end of the war in May, the US Army lost between 85,000 and 100,000 casualties, more than during the Battle of the Bulge. I mean, on one end it's not surprising when in front of them they faced guys that have been at war since 1940. In February 1945, Private First Class Clay Blair of the 84th Infantry Division said, "Every time I turned around, there was a new guy. You never really got to know the replacements. And a lot of them didn't last long enough to learn your name anyway." Even worse, during the crossing of the Royal River, Sergeant Miller's 2nd Infantry Division reported, "We lost so many men crossing the river, and the replacements couldn't keep up. You'd see new faces in your squad every day, but by the next morning, half of them were gone again. It felt like we were getting ground down little by little." After the terrible fighting across the Royal River, US armies pushed towards the Rhine, Germany's ultimate bearer. In March 1945, Lieutenant Carl Smith of the 78th Infantry Division recalled, "I remember getting a fresh batch of replacements just before we hit Cologne. We barely had time to brief them before we were back on the line. By the end of the week, more than half of them were gone, either dead or wounded. It was brutal. The casualty rate was so high. It felt we were feeding men into a meat grinder." Eventually, Allied forces were all positioned along the Rhine, ready for the final operation into Germany. Here's what Private First Class Harry Wiseman, 35th Infantry Division, remembered. "We had some replacements join us right before we crossed the Rhine. They were just kids, some of them shaking from nerves. We tried to keep them calm, but there wasn't much you could do. Most of them didn't make it to the other side." All these quotes might seem repetitive, but that's the entire point. It's not my opinion that fighting as a US infantryman was hell, and that American soldiers were essentially used as cannon fodder. It's the guys that witnessed the battles that are saying it, all throughout the war, from Italy all the way to the end. In the last weeks, it became clear that German soldiers fought for a lost cause. The last stronghold should have been easily wiped out, but against new replacements, the outcome was always bloody. For example, our friends from the 153rd Infantry Regiment, the ones that fought in San Pietro, they suffered around 275 casualties between the 6th and the 7th of April. Near Weikersheim, a random German village located halfway between the French border and Nuremberg. I mean, I don't even have the words to describe what kind of tragedy that is. Captain Herbert R. Simon of the 22nd Infantry Regiment said, "There was only one man left in the company who had landed on D-Day. He was KIA in mid or late April. It broke my heart to think he survived so long just to die during the final days." In conclusion, the individual replacement system made life hell for American soldiers during World War II. It was a pure wasteful management of human resources, and to a certain degree almost criminal. And the worst is that there were so many people ringing the alarm bell. There were also so many solutions available. As you could see, the casualty rates among replacements was very high, and many of them didn't even last a week on the battlefield. Soldiers were deployed completely alone right into unfamiliar units, sometimes joining them just before an attack. The constant flow of replacements created a real lack of unit cohesion. This was especially detrimental in combat, where trust and teamwork are essential. The lack of continuity in personnel compounded this by creating a sense of perpetual loss and disconnection, as soldiers frequently lost friends or felt they were surrounded by temporary or expendable spare parts. The problem is that the US Army continued the individual replacement system in Korea. The only improvement was that soldiers were not expected to remain in combat until the end of the war. There was an upgrade. They only deployed for a fixed period of time of 12 months. The US Army used the same system in Vietnam, although this brought a new set of problems. Because of that, unit rotation started in 1966-1967 and was only fully formalized by 1969. This allowed entire units, such as battalions and companies, to serve together for about 12 months before being relieved. From this moment on, this became the standard procedure of US ground forces, decades after everyone else had already implemented such a system. My friends, this video was sponsored by MyHeritage. If you want to study your family history and build this amazing family tree like I did, remember to sign up for a 14-day free trial and enjoy all the amazing features MyHeritage has to offer.